All right, so welcome back, those of you. Welcome to some new folks. I'm Jim Setzer. This is Images by Design Studio, and this is yet another in our Photographers Workshop series. So if you've been here before, you know the drill. We always start with welcomes and introductions. You've already heard me. Let's just say, introduce yourself, say your name, and why you decided to come to this particular workshop. What about high-speed sync and TTL intrigued you? You've either been shooting it all these years and you're here to share your wisdom, or you never take your flashes out of the box and you really need to that encouragement to get it going, or whatever. So let's start with Michael.
Michael MTI, Nikon shooter, and I've got a few flashes and I've bought some stuff. I've played around with it a little bit, shot some family and everything. I do a lot of reading. I got a lot of time where I can do that, and so I've got an idea what some of it is, and when to use it, when not to use it. But TTL, I'm not a big fan of, but I think it's one of those things. People think it's the, oh, I put on TTL, it's good to go. All I do is click. Mm-hmm. And I'll have to admit, I was that way when I first started, before I really got into figuring out what is it. And I was like, wow, no, it's not auto.
Good. Right.
I'm Annette, Nikon as well, and I have 3 speed lights that fit in the box or the bag. I bought a bracket for my camera. I used to use one of them on a bracket, and then I got a bunch of stands. I bought the controllers, so I was playing around with that, but I guess I don't do it enough, that I'm not fast. So like if I go to a party, it takes me like forever to set up a thing to take a picture of the group at the party or something like that. So I really want to like figure out. And high-speed sync, I've never tried to overpower the sun, so I'm interested in hearing about it and maybe try and get those things out and use them.
Okay, great.
I'm going to skip over. I am Kelsey.
Hi, Kelsey.
I'm a Canon shooter. I've never used a flash. I'm just here to see what else I can learn, give wisdom if needed.
Oh, wisdom, that's a strong word. I don't think you're going to get any of that in this room. You'll get opinions. We all have opinions.
That's what. I can get opinions too. I can give opinions if you need. But
Yes, please.
yeah, TTL, I'm very familiar with high-speed sync. We've invested in Ellen Cromset for high-speed sync recently.
Great.
It's a little intimidating.
Yeah,
I
that's
do a lot
good
of
gear.
outdoor maternity shoots and newborns. And I would like to start using it. So I figured if I learn something from anyone other than him, it'd be good.
Wow.
He's the only one I ever learned from anywhere, so. But we're here because I now have nights available, so we're able to come to these things together.
Great, fantastic, welcome.
I'm Lance. This is the first workshop that I've been to, although I had been to a meeting before, but I have been shooting for, I don't want to say how long because it makes me sound way old, but this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I actually fairly recently conducted a kind of a workshop out at the Chesapeake City Park about high-speed sync, shooting on bright sunny days, and it's a very handy tool to have in your belt from a creative standpoint. So I love talking about this stuff. I also work for Canon, so I've spent many years talking about this stuff, training classes and as an engineer. But I'm mainly here because I like to hear other people's takes on technique, and I like to hear how people would use it. And anything I can learn, anything I can share, I'm always willing to do so.
Great, so you can catch me in any lies, and please, we all have different experiences, and that's what these are really all about, is kind of sharing our own experiences of this stuff. I'm an engineer at heart, and so I'm all about a lot of it about the science of all this. So a lot of what I've thrown up on my slides is the science of it. I want to hear people that are, using these technologies and why and how that makes a difference, that's going to be hopefully, other people can bring those kind of contributions as well. So
Don't let him fool you because he's very excited.
Who, me?
Can't wait to learn something tonight. Don't let him fool you.
all right, Daniel.
I'm Daniel, I shoot Nikon. Right now I shoot with 2 manual flashes. So this is a new topic for me. I enjoy learning. So that's what the main reason why I'm here for, just learning.
Great. All right.
Okay, Joanne, I shoot Sony. Yay!
Hey.
Which one?
The E7 II.
It's an R2, yeah, nice camera.
Want the 3 or the 9,
Wow.
but my husband won't let me just yet. Still working on that.
It's a lot easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, right?
I'm learning that.
Isn't this Cyber Monday? There's got to be somebody that's got that on sale somewhere, right?
No.
Huh.
I'm wanting to get into flash photography more. I think I've got my natural lighting pretty good, and now I want to kind of move into one studio. Like you said, it's a good thing to know and have in your pocket when you need it.
Yeah.
Or, I have 2 flashes, actually 3. I just bought, because it's on sale for Black Friday, I just bought the Flashpoint 600, and I also got a deal with the 8200.
Oh yeah, those little strobes, yeah.
So they're coming in, that came in today and the other's coming tomorrow, so I'd like to know how to use them.
Yeah, great. All right, outstanding. All right. So, because I'm going to do a couple of demos and we'll have a conversation, I thought we would start the conversation tonight with just a quick conversation about histograms. Who knows and loves and uses histograms with every single shoot? Yeah. 99% of the time. Yeah, so this will be a very short conversation, but a lot of this is for the home audience too. The people that can't get here, we're recording this up on YouTube. By the way, I'll be stopping like every 25 minutes to restart this because of the usual camera stuff. So if that goes off in your middle of making a comment or a question, I'm going to make it a point this time to make you stop and restart that, because we missed some really great comments and questions from the last couple ones that we were talking while I was resetting the camera. So I'm going to try to not make that mistake again as we kind of refine this whole process about. So histograms, if you all use histograms, you know basically what they are and how to read them: darkness, brightness, high to low. For anybody out there in YouTube land, it's really just a graphical picture of the exposure that you just took. Or any picture. You could pull it into Lightroom, you could pull a histogram, whatever. You could see what the picture looks like from a graphical perspective. So over here you have your highlights, and in this particular internet example, not a bad histogram. You've got some highlights in here. Nothing's completely blown out. In other words, it's jammed up against this edge. Nothing over here on the low side, the shadows, is completely jammed up against the edge, so we haven't lost any detail in the shadows. In general, that bell-shaped curve tells you you've got a relatively well exposed picture. And because we haven't lost anything, if you shot it raw, you can always bring back some of those shadows or bring back those highlights and shadows in post and still be able to, you've got all the detail, all the data is still there. So I thought I'd do a quick demo. What that's all about. Let's see if I can get this to work. Hopefully. It'll work. Okay. Beautiful. There we go. All right, so there's the back of my camera. So if I just take a picture of this kind of relatively blank wall, what's the histogram going to look like?
If you go to the left.
Over the left? Over the right?
Probably a little bit more to the right. Probably fairly.
And what about the shape of it?
Should probably be mostly a spike coming in.
Yeah, I think you're going to get mostly a spike.
Alright.
And there you go.
I
So
was thinking right So I was like, yeah, over to the left.
Yeah, so it's mostly a white wall, and so you're going to get, you know, mostly this spike of whites. It's not, I'm not throwing a whole lot of light at it, so we haven't lost anything. We haven't blown out any of the highlights. Most of that is the white of the wall. And then you see this kind of trail here. Well, this little hump right here is probably that shadow you see on the far left. And then the stuff that's trailing off beyond that is all the nooks and crannies and stuff that you see in the picture, right? So that's kind of the,
It's actually pretty good exposure for white.
considering the wall, and you know, we're not using any additional light. I mean, the light in here really isn't all that great. This is a set at f4.5. It's a 1/5 of a second exposure. The meter in my camera says it's, you know, about 2 stops up. So it's about right where you would expect it to be. Right. So if I were to dial this back until the meter inside my camera said it was right about the midpoint, I take another shot, you would expect that the white point would be, or they would be spiked up right about the middle. So there you go. There's your histogram. Pretty easy read, right? But what if we introduce something else to the picture? What if we take and we... Oh, sorry, Michael. Who was working before? You must have moved the chair. If we throw something in that picture, what's that going to do to our histogram?
It gives us probably spike on both ends.
Yeah, it's going to become bimodal, right? You've got this big darkish area. Nothing's black, but it's darkish. And so...
Are you matrix metering or which?
Yeah, it's just this full frame matrix metering, right? So there's all the white area. There's the shadow of that black thing. You can see that right there. It's that kind of middle gray shadow. And then there's the darkish area of that reflector. So that's kind of how you read your histogram, right? Sound good?
And the height of this, I think I got this right, all the tall spikes just mean there's a lot of that in it. It doesn't mean it's underexposed or overexposed, it just means there's a lot of that.
Yeah, the left and the right are showing you the over and under exposure, right? The height is showing you the amplitude and how much of that particular level of luminance there is. All right? Good. Let's see if I can move this back. Any other, you guys all have experience with histograms. What do you guys use your histograms for? Do you use it with every shot?
I do when I'm outside to make sure, because half the time I can't tell with the little picture on the thing whether it looks good or not.
Yeah, you can't trust this, right? It may look beautiful in here, but if your histogram tells you something different, trust your histogram. It is the analysis of the picture, not what this LCD that may or may not be correct is telling you. Other thoughts, ideas before we move on?
Well, I think one of the most valuable things you'll learn from a histogram is making sure that you're not losing data, as you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Clipping both either shadow or highlight. Highlights is the main concern because that's where it typically happens. But making sure you don't clip out data so that if you bring it into post later, you have the leeway to bring it back down and still have usable data there to affect the exposure there. And the other thing to remember too, I think, for a lot of people who just start using histograms is there is no such thing as the perfect ideal histogram. You know, the goal is not to make a bell curve in the middle. That's not, you know, it's all going to vary depending on your subject.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people make the mistake of assuming that you try to create this perfect curve, and that's not realistic.
Right, right. You know, you've heard the phrase shooting to the right or shooting to the left. It depends on your camera. It depends on your shooting style. So some people shoot so that you see that bell curve kind of peaking somewhere in the, you know, right quartile, or, you know, they shoot to the left, they shoot more low key. And again, it depends on what is important to you and what you are or not willing to accept as far as loss of data.
And what you're shooting. I mean, if you're shooting a long exposure at night, it's going to be
Yeah, star trails, you're going to have a big old block of black if you did it right on the back side, but you're going to have the spikes in different color frequencies for the different colored stars or whatever else you've got out there. And you're going to see very, very, very definite lines of color along the way for those whatever stars are in your frame. I think histograms are probably one of the best tools that have been given to us in the digital age that you never had. In the old days, you'd walk around with a meter and you'd try to get an exposure and you'd dial in your settings and then you would click and pray. And then 2 weeks later, if you were like me and didn't take copious notes for every single exposure, you'd try to figure out why it did or didn't turn out. And now you've got this data not only right as you're shooting, because you get a histogram in the eyepiece, which is brilliant. I wish all cameras had electronic viewfinders these days. But at least with, if you can chimp on the back and you can look at this stuff and you can make your immediate corrections and get the right exposure if you haven't got it just right. Anything else? All right, so with that out of the way, let's talk about flashes. And this applies whether it's a little on-camera flash, your pop-up flash, or a external strobe, however it's connected, wired or wireless. In manual mode, which is the way all of them can work in manual mode, a lot of them are designed to work that way exclusively. They're designed to work in powers which are levels of power. From full power, let's go to this. Can you guys see that little display on that? Yeah, so if I come in here and I dial that up, I should be able to see that display go all the way up. So that's a full power. So that is full power for that particular flash, right? It's going to be different for every single light source. That full power is certainly much, much more than this little speed light, although this one's not too bad. So you work with those powers just like you work with stops in your other exposure variables, your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO. And it's done that way on purpose because it's just like if you work with exposure triangles and you know how to work that, if you change any of those variables, you can compensate for it by changing through stops any of the other stuff. So if you just you've got it all figured out and you've got all the right lighting, but maybe you decide you want, I don't know, a shallower depth of field, so you open your aperture by a stop. You've got to do something to compensate for that, either by changing your shutter speed, adjusting your ISO, or if you happen to be using strobes or speed lights, you can now adjust them accordingly to make that compensation work. Does that make sense? Yes? Anything? So, the speed lights and strobes you guys work on, most of you guys say you work primarily in manual mode. And do you find you spend a lot of time dialing things in and then
Moving it forward,
moving it back, and the clouds come in, and the light changes and whatever. Do you find you spend more time adjusting the powers on your strobes or doing like exposure compensation to adjust whatever you've left in automatic on your camera? What's your guys' process? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. Everybody works a little differently.
I do everything from changing the signal strength on the flash to adjusting the triangles on the camera. I don't care what works.
I try mainly to change the power of the speed lights or strobes more than, last resort is going back into my camera and changing the settings in my camera. Because a lot of times I'll try and have my camera settings how I want it, and then I'll try and manipulate the light to get the shot I want.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if whatever's important to you for that particular creative composition, right? So if depth of field is the thing that's key to you, then obviously you don't want to sacrifice that because there's too little or too much light. You want to be able to manipulate the other dependent variables to make it all happen, right? Absolutely. And then, like I mentioned before, these are all unitless measures of light, and that's the reason for it is because there's no standard way to know how much light is going to come into the camera. First of all, studio strobes are measured completely differently than speed lights. Studio strobes are typically measured in watt seconds, which is a measure of the electricity that is sent to the flash tube itself to fire it. So that's kind of a bad measure to begin with because different flash tubes have different levels of efficiency. So these may be 600 watt seconds, where an Paul C. Buff Einstein 640, I bet if you put them right next to each other, they're probably exactly the same because one might have a better, more efficient tube or not. And it really doesn't matter because, as you know, light's going to fall off with different distances. So there's really no point in trying to put a unit to that. Speed lights are measured in waveguides, which is a measure of light reflected at a certain distance using a certain zoom setting on the strobe and then reflected back a certain distance again. So it's another industry standard that is so loose and so easy to manipulate, it really is almost meaningless unless you're comparing one speed light to another and you hope the two manufacturers used a similar testing methodology. But again, there's no way to tell unless you put them literally side by side on a bench with the exact same light meter, the exact same distance, and took a comparative shot to say which one is slightly brighter than the other. And in the end, it doesn't really matter because every shot you'll be working with slightly different distances and stuff. So that's why it's useless. You just have to work with the light you got and adjust after you've brought it in and measured it. Just do a quick. So in manual mode, full power, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, it's going to be pretty overexposed, right? So you've got, again, back to your histogram, all this slammed up against there. Obviously, this is all blown out. That's lost detail. Yeah, you've got, there is no black anymore because there's so much light against that reflector that it's just kind of this grayish lump and no black at all. And then if I were to dial that all the way down to its lowest power, 1256, we're probably back before I turn the lights on. And you can see it's a very different light. Right.
You can use that to your advantage too, though. I mean, blowing the background. And the
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
One of the most common colors I use when I do studio shoots is gray, a medium gray, because with a medium gray you can make it completely black, completely white, or any shade between white and gray in between, depending on how much light you hit it with. And that's a perfect example of that. Like when you blew up that wall, you didn't see any detail in the texture of the bricks because it blew it out white. You could also make that white wall gray, which is what the camera naturally is trying to do anyway by metering it. Or you can darken it down and make it all the way down to black if you wanted to. So it gives you a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, I do something similar with these black and white backdrops. I can get just about any shade of gray I want between, lowering the light on the whites or bringing up light on the blacks. And
So, but then in that scenario, is there one light that's lighting the wall and a different light lighting your subject?
oh, sure.
In the example I gave, yeah.
Oh, yeah. You definitely want to light your background separately than you're lighting your subject.
Yeah, if you just start out with trying to do a home studio and the first backdrop you should get is like a gray one because you can then color it with gels if you want, or like you said, you can make it white or you can make it black. That's what I read anyway.
Yeah.
Rather than getting a white or a black one, I mean,
Right.
Right. And if you were here for any of that low-key portraiture, you can see, you can make a black background without any background, right? You just need enough difference. You need 3 stops of light between your subject and whatever's in the background to make it completely black if you wanted to. So we made that white wall black, and we exposed, just shot our subject, and voila. So it's all in the light, right?
How far away did you have your subject from the
It was back about, about 6-8 feet, and then another 6-8 feet to the camera, so, yeah, to the light, yeah. Okay, so that's manual lighting with strobes, and so that brings us to, finally, talking about doing something different through the lens. So we saw it took a couple of trials and errors to kind of get the lights dialed in to something that maybe we liked. The advantage of using through the lens is you are leveraging some of the technology that's already inside your camera. Bless you. You're basically allowing the camera's metering system to help dial in that light to be able to shoot the exposure you're looking for. So here's basically the sequence of, let's see, I'm trying to think. Yeah, so all the lights, all the components in your lighting system all have to be able to support all this. So most cameras today, even the entry-level cameras, support TTL. A lot of triggers today support TTL if you use wireless triggers, and almost every speed light out there supports TTL. Not every studio strobe does, but there's some technology beyond this work group, but there are ways to make some TTL. Hypersync is a way to make non-TTL studio strobes do something similar. But the whole concept is this. You tell the camera to send a pre-flash signal to your lights, whether they be on camera or off camera or whatever. They light up the subject, that light comes back, the shutter's closed through all this. The light comes back through the lens, the meter reads all that light, does some pretty quick calculations, and sends an adjustment signal back out to those lights to say, brighten up or lower yourself to match whatever I've told my exposure compensation or whatever my proper exposure for this particular thing is supposed to be. So, you saw that last exposure we did with manual, and you showed it completely blown out with full power, and we dialed it all the way back down. So let's go back. I'm basically just going to take this trigger and I'm going to change its mode to TTL. And it doesn't say that right away on this, or did it?
It did.
Okay, good. I just updated the firmware in this one. And so that whole process is going to take place, right? When I push the shutter button, it's going to send a signal to the through the hot shoe to this trigger. The trigger is going to send a signal to the flash, send that pre-flash back through the lens. Meter's going to meter it. Meter's going to calculate it. Meter's going to give it an adjustment. It's going to all go back through there, and then the actual fire is going to happen. Shutter's going to open. All that's going to take place. Ready? Done. So that all takes place in about 2 milliseconds. Enough that almost none of us can perceive when you're using TTL or not. Bring that back. And by the way, my exposure compensation is like nothing. So you can see it did a pretty good job of trying to, as best it could, put that middle gray in there. And anybody want to guess what it told this particular flash it needed to be at in order to get that? No, it's not on the screen. I mean, what do you see?
Are you talking about the power of the, okay.
Yeah, it's just going to say TTL in your EXIF data. But in this particular trigger, I can have it tell me what it told the flash to compensate for. And it said that it told the flash to go to 1/64th plus a third.
That's what I said in my headphones to never say it out loud.
Why didn't you?
I don't know, I was like, that was 164.
Yeah.
And I was like, don't say it out loud, to be wrong.
All right. So the big upside to TTL, you can dial in pretty good light pretty darn quickly, right? So if you're shooting weddings, or you're doing portraiture on the run, or some other thing where, or even, wildlife, birds in flight, stuff like that, TTL is pretty darn great because you don't have the time, the luxury of time to be able to dial in the lights to exactly where you want to go. In a studio like this, fantastic. I got all the time in the world before my client shows up. I can dial in the light, even use myself for a mannequin as a stand-in, and I can be perfect. So when my subject walks in the door, boom, I don't have to waste any time. We're shooting right off the bat. But in a lot of situations, again, wedding photographer, all that kind of stuff, you can't do that. You need to be able to get that proper exposure, and it's one less thing that you need to be able to do, you have to do before you're actually in there shooting away. So that's the big upside to doing TTL. Who wants to talk about the downside of TTL? In one word. Yeah, but if it gives you the right exposure.
I know, but I
Well,
don't control. I feel
I
like
mean,
I
just your
stand
example
flat.
here and talking about weddings. Weddings, a lot of times you have a bride in white, groom in black. All right, TTL's trying to make that middle gray.
Yeah.
So you have to,
But that's more of a metering thing, right? You could still have a problem with that if you're metering, if you're spot metering, and you're trying to take a picture of a tuxedo, and that autofocus point lands on the lapel versus the blouse of the tuxedo, you're going to get wildly different exposures. If you're not shooting completely manual, nobody would shoot a wedding completely manual. That would take forever, right? You're going to allow the camera some ability to help you with that exposure. So it's more of a metering thing. Where I think TTL is really important there is, like I said, not having to spend the time running up and down the power dial on your lights to get something that looks good.
I think it's important to remember too that there is a degree of control that you still have. Even though the flash is automatically metering and setting in auto flash, you can still bump flash exposure up and down. So you're not stuck with what the flash is telling you need. It's just that it's kind of doing its own measurement with, well, the camera's doing the measurement, but doing its own measurement to determine what the camera thinks is proper.
Right.
And if you don't agree with the camera, then you can override it and say, well, I want it lower or higher or whatever.
So I got a question. This might sound really dumb, but right now we in TTL, you're shooting that circle reflector.
Mm-hmm.
If you take your reflector and move it up, won't the compensation be completely different then? If you move it up?
If the black takes up more of the frame and I'm matrix metering, yeah, because it's going to be more of the frame, and so it's going to bring the exposure up because more of what it's measuring is going to be darker. That make sense?
what are you metering now on this?
Matrix metering, so full frame metering.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I was curious, because manual, I think it's just whatever you have it set, it's just going to shoot the exact same thing. So if you have it full power and you move it up some, it's going to shoot still full power.
Yeah, so you got to think about, you got two different things going on there, right? You've got your camera's metering system, which is trying to determine the appropriate overall exposure based on your metering mode, what it's seeing, all that kind of stuff. And then you have the power of the flash, which is changing the ambient light that's coming into the lens. And so you're having to work and adjust on that. With TTL, you're adding that light to that exposure calculation and making those changes and adding a little bit to it. But like Lance was saying, even in TTL mode, you can usually up to 3 stops up and down, so really a 6-stop range. So sometimes, let's say you're setting up a portrait, let's say you're setting up the bride and groom at a wedding, you got 2 lights. You could set a key light, like TTL +1, and a fill light, TTL -3, and you'd still have a nice key to fill ratio going on there without having to sit there and dial all that stuff in on yourself. So in that regard, TTL is really nice. You can still give very nice, very creative lighting without having to spend a lot of time because you've set those ratios between different lights in your system, and it won't show it on the screen. But when I will take a shot, it'll adjust and did it show it? No, it doesn't show it. But on my screen here, I've told it I've wanted the TTL +3 stops. So you can see it's really brought that up another 3 stops. And I'm still in TTL
Well, you can
mode.
see it to the right where the closest to the flash in that image because
Oh, yeah.
there's a detail in the bricks. See it there?
Yeah, and you can just see it in the histogram, right? So, right,
The what?
I brought
Yeah.
three full stops, right? So there you go. There's the difference between those two, and they're still in TTL mode. The biggest disadvantage to TTL is consistency. If I take 20 pictures in TTL mode, it goes back through and it does those calculations for every single shot, and I will guarantee you, if I look at those close enough, I will see inconsistencies with the amount of exposure from one shot to the next.
Is that a bad thing though?
It's a bad thing if you're like in this studio and you expect every exposure to be exactly the same.
And if you want to batch edit too, that could be a pain.
And if you're in a batch edit, exactly. You're like, oh yeah, here's that one scene. You want to be able to bump, you want to get that exposure done in blocks. You've taken 4,000 pictures that day. You've got to edit in blocks or you'll be there forever. So you're right. That inconsistency can be a hindrance. But if you're shooting outdoors and the clouds are rolling by and the light's coming and going,
Right.
that TTL can be a lifesaver because you're not getting those drastic shifts between light and dark and
Well, also to
exposure.
go back to this example of the bride and the groom, I mean, shooting weddings, I mean, that can be one of the most challenging shoots you ever have, you know? So, TTL is very handy because the images after the wedding is over, where you can stage people and you know what your distance is going to be and your lighting is consistent and so forth, that is easier to deal with. But when you're getting action shots of them coming down the aisle, or when people are dancing out at the reception, or when you have a lot of movement and varying distances with the bride in the bright gown and the groom in the dark tux, having your flash manually set to 1 power is going to be inconsistent from shot to shot because of the change in distance and all the other variables of ambient light and everything else. So ETTL can actually help you in that regard because it'll kind of make adjustments on the fly as necessary depending on where you are and how much running and gunning you're doing to try to capture these crazy bride and groom, you know, running around.
If you're doing something like that, is your flash on your camera?
Well, typically, yes. But you can do it off
What's
camera
that?
too, but in that case, doing running and gunning most likely.
I got another one in the camera.
Yeah, I just seem to have trouble when I have it on the camera, like, I feel like I have to be like right on top of the subject to get enough light. I don't know why. Probably not working right.
I don't know. I never mount a camera, flash directly on my camera. I hate the light it gives. I'm always moving it off, at least this far, right? Arm's length away. Yes.
For Nikon, what does the I stand for?
Intelligent.
I
You
didn't
stand
stand
for
for, so.
Yeah.
Intelligence.
Yeah.
I think it's like enter through the lens. I think that's what I
What
found
is?
for the E for ETTL. Is
No,
it
it's
enter?
evaluative.
Evaluative.
Oh yeah.
Dang it. Well, I knew
Yeah,
it started with an E.
Because the rest of the world was perfectly fine with the word matrix, but no, Canon had to come up with evaluative because it's so easy to say.
There might be some copyrights there that they couldn't use.
Well,
Yeah.
Nikon has changed it to I.
Yeah.
So.
I don't know who had it first. Anybody know? Not that it matters.
I
but-
would say Canon.
Oh, okay. The Canon shooter says it must have been Canon.
Yep.
I think Sony invented it years ago. And
You know, I
Yeah.
started on a Sony, so I will back that too.
Mhm.
I'll back
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
It
Good.
was my
Many
first
years
ever
ago.
camera, and it was a Sony.
The Nikon was known for their, you know, flash technology stuff, but I don't know if that means they were first. I just know that, I mean, it's kind of, the playing field's leveled off now, but they were quite known for that.
Yeah, the Flash Commander creative lighting system in the optical, triggering days was actually pretty good. You know, we've all moved past it because of all the limitations of optical triggering, but yeah, good stuff. Any other thoughts on TTL before we move on?
I feel like sometimes TTL can get a bad rap.
Yes.
Like, I feel like sometimes, and, like you were saying, you go to groups, you can run across people that will down TTL, and I haven't been shooting as long as, like, some people I know. But,
Wow.
well, I'm allowed to say it.
You had to say that in a recorded workshop.
Oh, yeah.
For posterity.
So, but when I was learning in school, we were taught ETTL or TTL, and we were taught to do everything manually as well. And coming from a background of shooting portraits and weddings and events, and now just doing events and portraits mostly, there's nothing wrong with like using ETTL or TTL, whatever brand you're using. TTL, yeah. But I feel like it can get a bad rap. Like, I feel like people will be like, you can use TTL, that doesn't make you a photographer, you need to use manual. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm shooting a 6-hour event, I'm not going to be using manual because I'm going to be exhausted after hour 3 and I'm going to miss so much.
Yeah.
So, like, I feel like it's not a bad thing, it's okay.
Right. Which would you rather be, that purist snob or the person that got all the shots of the day?
Because
Because they're just tools,
I
right?
just shot a Thanksgiving dinner where there was like 60 people in and out, just constantly. And I shot an ETTL, and I didn't shoot manual the whole time either, because I was using like 80, because I wanted to get
Yeah.
for some of my shots. But But there's a lot of people out there that will tell you if you use TTL, you're not a real photographer or something like that.
Nonsense.
I just
Yeah,
want to
that's
crush that rumor.
I can
Well,
It's
tell
not
you,
I
true.
think if you use TTL, you have to know how to use it. And like Lance was talking about,
Yep.
Yeah.
the flash compensation.
Right.
I mean, if you know,
I mean-
and then going back to your histograms, be able to read what you're doing.
Exactly.
The
It
sign
depends
was
on your
good.
circumstance. I rarely use TTL in the studio. Or if I do, I just use it to quickly dial in the lights and then I use those values to quickly convert to manual.
Exactly.
But if you're in a dynamic environment, time is of the essence. There's no reason not to use those tools to your advantage and get the proper shot. It's like the people that carry around like 5 lenses in their lens bag because they think that's really important. They always shoot just primes. I'm like, well, that's all well and good. Yeah, you're going to get the shots you're going to get are very crisp. But guess what? I'm not going to miss a shot with my ultra long zoom.
Exactly.
So mine aren't going to be as sharp as yours, but I'm not going to miss that critical moment either. So, different strokes for different folks. But the people that say one method is better than the other, it's
Use
just
your tools.
yeah, use your tools.
Use
But
your tools. Use them. There's nothing wrong with using your.
I think it's
your
mainly
backup
people
tricks.
have this idea in their head that whenever they hear the word auto anything, that, oh, that means that the camera is doing all the thinking for you. But whether the camera's doing the metering or you're doing the metering in your head,
Mhm.
or you're using a hand meter to do metering, part of photography, and has always been part of photography, is determining and metering light. And that's also with metering flash. So it's always been part of the craft. And just because it has the word auto in it doesn't mean that you should never use it because somehow it means you're less of a photographer. It's just another tool in your tool belt to use because it's not the only thing that you have to concern yourself with when framing and shooting a shot. You have settings on camera, and you have flash metering, and you have composition, and you have ambient light going on, and you have all this other stuff. And if you think it's best to manually worry about all of that simultaneously, good on you, but you're increasing your likelihood of missing something.
Right.
Exhausting.
I have exhausted.
I get exhausted.
Yeah, and our brains don't work that fast, right?
No.
Use the little computer that's here. I mean, why not for the right purpose in the right
Exactly.
situations.
There have been weddings that I've shot where I've been sick as a dog, and I found myself flipping over to auto, see what it tells me, go back to manual, or go back to AV even, and just be like, I can work with this, I can work around this, I can make my adjustments, flip back to auto 10 minutes later, make sure I'm still right. Because
Why not?
I'm not thinking straight, but I'm also not going to miss something because somebody thinks I don't know what I'm doing if I'm going to auto as well. So.
Well, just don't let them see your camera, they'll never know you're in auto.
All right, so the second topic for tonight was high-speed sync, and you really can't start talking about high-speed sync until you know exactly how your shutter operates. The shutter in your camera, despite what all the cartoons and movies show you, is not the aperture opening and closing. It's actually a 2-curtain design, and I found this little GIF that's only half accurate, but it's enough to get us started with it. So a curtain opens, and then a curtain closes behind it. It's a 2-curtain design. So curtain opens to expose a sensor, curtain comes down behind it. Now what's wrong with this GIF is your camera does not have an infinite number of these shutters that are sitting at the top of your camera moving down. What happens is your one exposure, first curtain comes down to expose the sensor, second curtain comes down to close it. The next exposure, it goes back the other direction, right? So that's the flaw in this GIF, is it doesn't have the curtains going back up to where they started from. But if you could just deal with that.
They're not on a roller?
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they roll behind the sensor and come back around again. Now that would be a neat design, right? But that's really how it works. And this method, as you see it right now, works really well up to a certain shutter speed. Because as you see these curtains open and closing at a certain rate, all cameras have a maximum speed these curtains can move at. And what you notice if you look in your manual, or we'll see it in the camera here in a second, is that's somewhere between 200 and 300, 1/200th and 1/300th of a second. is the fastest these shutters can move all the way open and come and close right behind them. And then you get to do the mechanics of the shutter can't physically move any faster than that without it getting much, much more expensive. So you get to cameras like the A9 or the, you know, the top end sport cameras from Canon and Nikon that can shoot, you know, closer to 20 frames a second. And they've got really, really super expensive shutter mechanisms. But the rest of us have to deal with shutter mechanisms that are a little bit, well, they're still reasonable. So here's what your shutter looks like up to about the 1/250th of a second shutter speed, right? Happy with that? Graphically, here's what's going on. So this is time across the bottom. That dotted yellow line is when that first curtain begins to open. The green solid line is when that first curtain has finished opening and your sensor is fully exposed. The red dotted line is when that second curtain begins to close, and the dotted blue line is when that second curtain is completely closed. That little window in the middle is that short period of time that your sensor is fully exposed. Make sense? And most of the time when you're shooting under 250th or whatever that max speed, that X sync speed is, your flash fires somewhere in the middle, usually in the middle of that window. And as you can see, the flash itself is, the flash pulse is typically much faster than your shutter speed. These lights at their lowest setting, the flash pulse lasts only 1/10,000th of a second. It's called your T01 speed, and it's in the spec manual in every speed light or whatever, and none of us ever pay any attention to it unless you're one of these people that like capture water droplets or something that need to know exactly how fast your flash pulse is on that. But it's important to know that it is much, much faster than the length of time that most of your exposures are, right? And when you're shooting under 250th of a second, that's fine. The one thing I'll note about this before we get into other topics is, you notice in this particular example, the flash pulse triggered right in the middle, right of that. A different mode that you can use for creative purposes is called second shutter or second curtain or second shutter sync, and that is that flash pulse is just before that second curtain begins to close. Okay, so most of these streaks are happening as that first curtain is opening, and before the flash pulse, you fire that to capture the rest of the setting just before the curtain closes, and you get those lovely little streaks there. Let's see. On Nikon cameras, you use the little flash button here. You hold that down, you dial it around, and you can set that mode to either, by default, it triggers in the middle of the exposure, or you can do that second curtain sync. It's called rear curtain sync on a Nikon. What's it called on a Canon?
Second curtain.
Second curtain. So rear curtain, second curtain means exactly the same thing. So how does your shutter manage speeds above that X sync or that maximum physical shutter speed? It does it by beginning to close that second shutter before the first shutter is done opening. So you get more of you don't get the entire sensor exposed all at the same time. And the faster you go, pretty soon your shutter is a little slit that slides down your sensor. Do you see how this might be a problem for your speed light that's triggering at 1/10,000th of a second? If you just took a regular strobe pulse and you fired it right now, what would your exposure look like? Yeah, you'd have this bright band somewhere near the middle of your exposure, and the rest of it would be ridiculously dark. And so traditional strobe firing doesn't work, a single pulse firing. These xenon tubes and these other technologies that fire these, you've got capacitors that build up a huge electric charge, high voltage, not a lot of current, but huge amounts of voltage. When the voltage reaches a peak, that's when your little indicator says, okay, you're ready to go. You hear the little whining noise, and it dumps all that power across a xenon tube, all that a lot of that electricity is turned into light. You get that very, very fast pulse. But it lasts for a very, very short amount of time. So, let me go back. Let me show the demo of this if I can. All right, you see my shutter speed? So I can dial and dial and dial and dial, and I get to 2/50th of a second, and it just simply won't go any further. I've reached that X sync speed, and my camera says, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to allow you to go any faster than this because you're not going to get a good exposure. But if I turn on sync capability in my trigger, now I can go much faster. So I've basically told my camera that I now support high-speed sync. Make sense? So when you run into that situation, that's probably what it is. Either your light doesn't support it, or you haven't turned on this mode if it's a camera or a trigger that supports all that.
High-speed sync, your light and your trigger almost support, right?
Yes, your light and your trigger need to support high-speed sync. Most cameras support high-speed sync, not necessarily all lighting equipment, and I'll show you why in this next slide. Remember that old pulse of light that was just that little spike that came up and went away? This is what the light has to do in order to support high-speed sync. Way before anything else happens, your light has to energize this frequency generator that begins to build up this pulse to the point where it can begin to pulse your light, your strobe, fast enough that to the perceivable eye and to your sensor, it seems like a constant light. And you notice how long it takes it to even get there before you can begin to open the shutter. It's almost 2 milliseconds, right? It's got to kind of get this quiescent point where it's really a more stable pulsating light. And then the shutter happens, right? So that's your little slit through the course of the thing. And then as soon as it closes, then it can bring down that circuitry and shut the whole thing down. So that's how high-speed sync works. It's a very different light. Because it's happening in 9 milliseconds, our eye doesn't perceive it, but your battery life does. So if you have to shoot if you have the option of shooting in high-speed sync and you're in a situation where battery life is important, like a wedding, don't use it unless you have to, because it will destroy your batteries. That just by the nature of the beast. It just has to do it because it's got to have that consistent light all the way through that band as the shutter is moving across that little sliver of your sensor. Do you find this to be true?
Yes.
When you're running high-speed sync, you're just dumping batteries left and right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my biggest fear is running out of battery.
Yeah.
There is another concern you have to be concerned with too, and that's reduced range. You don't have the range with your flash as you normally would if you shot normal. But, you know, there are certain things
I feel like
that...
when you're using it though, you kind of expect that. You really want to use it.
Well, if you think about what it's doing, you
Yeah.
can understand why it doesn't have the
Yeah.
range, because it's taking that capacitance power
Right.
and it's having to stroboscopically really kind of fire off that head for a longer period.
It's just
So
cool to see it like that.
Yeah.
I think about it in your head, and I can think about all the things that I learned in my undergraduate degree when we were studying this. But then when you actually like see it again, you're just like, oh yeah, that's what it looks like.
So this could become an issue with overheating your speed lights too, couldn't it? If you're doing if you're doing it high speed, after high speed, after high speed.
I've not found that to be the case. You know, like he was saying, you know, the power output at any given millisecond is never going to be as high as a single pulse strobe. Right. So you're not making the bulb quite as hot. You're keeping it at more of a kind of a, it's like running your microwave at a lower power. You ever notice it turns on and off and on and off and on and off. In the end, you still cook your food. It takes a little bit longer, but you know, you're not, maybe that's a bad analogy, I'm not sure. But yeah, I haven't found it to be the case. It may shorten the life of your speed light because you are cycling this thing quite a lot more, but
And it doesn't ever like get so hot that it's gonna overheat anything. It hasn't, like, it's not, like, just, for example, this is a horrible example, but like, it's not where one would be 100 degrees and one would be like 80 degrees. It's not what it is. So it's not like you're doing 100 degrees for so long. You're doing 80 degrees and it's kind of going like this.
Well, remember, the total power that the flash has to use is in the capacitor of the flash.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be using more than that
Yeah.
for this versus a full regular normal burst. What you're doing is you're reducing the power in the range and spreading it out a bit to last for the passing of both curtains so that it stays consistently on throughout that time. But it's not doing it longer at that full power that we're used to with a single
Yeah.
burst.
You should be
So
okay.
it's the flashes are designed to do it, and you don't have to worry about it. You really don't. Cool. He just throws in cool.
He's soaking it all in.
Yeah, I feel like it can be a lot to.
Yeah.
Been doing it for so long, I feel like I'm still learning every single day.
So another issue I've read about when it comes to high-speed sync, how many people use a meter? And when you use the high-speed sync, it kind of throws out using the meter, am I right? At least that's what I've read.
Useful uses a meter in this room, I was just wondering, like,
A light meter?
Uh-huh.
Do you use one too?
Okay.
I haven't used
Well,
one
we
in
do, we don't
years.
use it for,
Not for my speed lights.
use
I
it for
use my
studio.
lights.
Just
yes.
for studio
Okay.
lights, yeah. So like, and not for like newborns, but like if we're doing an in-studio maternity shoot, I'll use it. I don't typically use it outside though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody use a gray card?
Oh, yeah.
Still have mine, yeah, I love mine.
Mhm.
18% good.
I have a hand meter that I use primarily because it's specifically designed to work with my studio lights.
Yeah.
So I can control the power of any of my lights right from my hand meter,
Mhm.
and I meter each light. Then I do a meter of all of them together so that I can ratio and set up my look the way I want it. You know,
I should have said that, it works with this with the studio light.
Mhm.
So like, I mean, it's like designed to, so we can actually
Yeah.
control the lights from the meter.
Oh,
So it's
okay,
kind of,
okay.
it's not just like, I have this meter, I'm gonna pop it and see.
Okay,
I mean, you can
that's what I
still
was
do
thinking.
that.
You can do
It's
that,
just
but we use
easier.
it because you can actually
So you
like,
don't have to keep running
It's
to
like
the
a
lights
screen
to change
you step
power.
on.
and so
Mhm.
forth.
it's very easy when you've got kids and 9 months pregnant women and they're like, I'm ready to go.
Right.
So it's easy to just go, whoop, and you do it, so. But yeah, I do. I don't know if it's just old school, I just like it. Okay. That's how I learned, so that's why it's so good about it.
Mhm.
I didn't learn it's a nice meter, not a really crappy one, but couldn't be done.
Well, that's all I had on my slides, guys. Any thoughts, other thoughts, ideas, comments? Great conversation tonight.
I do have one, and it combines both of the topics you talked about. High-speed sync, I found it especially helpful when shooting outdoors in bright sunlight,
Sure.
because we talked about overpowering the sun. Somebody mentioned it earlier. What's cool about it is it really, if you're going to shoot with high-speed sync and shoot outdoors on a bright sunny day with a strobe, you can actually think about your shot in terms of 2 exposures. You have your flash, which you can use high-speed sync if you want to bump your shutter speed up higher, which will bring down those bright skies. Because remember, the skies in the distance is not going to be lit by your flash. The flash that's not going to light up that, unless someone has a flash that strong looking, because I'd love to see it. But,
Yeah, but they tend to melt your subject. So
Yeah.
then in the end, the final result is just this charcoal thing.
They get tanned real quick.
Yeah, yeah.
But it gives you control of your background and your subject. Your flash
Right.
controls the exposure of your subject.
Yep.
Your shutter speed can control the exposure of the background. And then having high-speed sync in your tool case here allows you to bump that shutter speed up higher than the 1/250th and darken that background more so, and then you can change a bright, completely white sky into a subdued, almost like a dawn or dusk look,
Yeah.
if you wanted to, even though you're shooting at high noon with bright sunlight. So it really is a lot of fun to play with if you've never done it before. You know, go out and give it a go and just have someone model for you and shoot. Let your flash, using TTL, you know, you can even have it automatically have the flash meter for the subject, and then just play with your shutter speed and bump your background down and really get these really cool creative looks. And you know, yeah, well, I mean, it's an easy thing to do and get a really unique look without having to do a lot of work in post to do it.
Right.
You know, you can just shoot it that way and have it and completely blow away your client, because they won't expect it, because they know what it was like out there. They know they were out there almost squinting at bright sunlight, and they're not expecting to see that really kind of romantic looking, dusk looking environment.
Right, and there's always 3 ways to achieve it too, which is kind of nice. You could use recompose, meter off of one or the other, and then recompose for the whole frame. You could use spot metering, or you could use flash compensation. So there's just different ways of achieving that same result that Lance was talking about. And so whatever works for you.
Yeah, if you leave your flash in auto and then leave your camera in manual, then all you have to worry about is focusing on manually adjusting your background exposure, what we call the ambient exposure. And then you can bump it darker or brighter or whatever you want to do, and let the TTL, I keep wanting to say TTL, let the TTL metering for the flash take care of your subject. And if you think it's not doing a good enough job and your subject looks too bright or too dark, just bump flash exposure comp up or down and darken or lighten them, and just in the turn of a dial, you can make them look perfect, and then all you have to worry about is just getting your background to look the way you want.
Yeah, that's how I kind of use, if I'm going to do flash, especially outdoor flash or even indoor, I use the camera as like, how do I want the ambient look? Do I want a black? Do I want a white? Do I want I want a nice background, the sunset and all this, and then the flash I use to light my subject, whether power and distance, to light the subject.
Well, one last thing I'll say about it too that's nice about it is it gives better separation between your subject and your background. Make sure your subjects stand out more. So if you're really doing like a model shoot or a portrait shoot or something like that, and they really want the picture to be all about them, which who doesn't, then it's nice to separate them from the background by darkening the background and just really giving a good, perfectly exposed flash exposure for them, and then they stand out and pop.
The TTL isn't trying to take the whole frame and even it out. It will actually just focus on your subject.
Well, no,
That's what I always thought the problem with TTL was. It was trying to do the whole picture, so you couldn't do that kind of scenario unless you went to manual.
Well, it meters the ambient for the whole thing initially.
Okay.
Then it fires the pre-burst and measures the light coming back into the different metering zones from the flash. None of that's going to be coming back from the sky in the background because the flash doesn't reach it.
Okay.
It's only going to be coming back off the subject. So the flash is really only affecting the subject at that point. So the TTL metering is not really going to be worried too much about the background, because it knows when it looked at the zones for the background, it says, okay, this is how much ambient light I have. I just fired the pre-burst. That light didn't change at all. That means it's outside of the range of my flash. So it just doesn't even worry about it.
Right.
And then it just focuses on the zones that it did affect.
Right. So that's going to, obviously, depending on your metering mode, whether it's spot or evaluative or whatever, metering mode is going to depend on what's part of that calculation. And a lot of times in here, I'll mix lights. I'll put my key light in TTL because I want that constant proper exposure on my subject, but I'll use manual. If I'm doing high key, I'll put a couple manual lights on high key and I'll blow out my background in manual mode. So you can mix those technologies all you want. You just have to know what's going to be a part of that TTL exposure calculation and be able to just kind of work with it. So a lot of it's a lot of trial and error until you kind of it all kind of clicks in your head and you can start playing with it. So. Yeah, just have fun. Shoot more.
So the general consensus is that it's worth the extra money to get the TTL. If you don't do weddings and stuff like that, if you're just mainly doing studio or portraits, is it worth the extra $200-300 to get the TTL, or is it just really a moot point if you're not going to be like, you know, run and gun kind of shooter?
I think it just comes down to your style.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, people make some absolutely amazing photographs. I mean, just very high-end photographers that have never shot TTL or just can't stand it and never use it. I personally use it because time is important to me, and I don't always have the luxury of being able to sit there and dial in the exact thing I want. Or there's things moving, right? I've got a very complex set going on, and I want to be able to change around all the accent light, you know, the hair lights and the key lights and stuff, and not have to deal with all that. So I want to make sure that this light on here, no matter what other changes I make, because light's going to bounce everywhere, right? It's going to, even hair light is going to bounce off that wall, and it's going to affect my exposure. So maybe I want to leave TTL on my key light for that. That's just me.
Okay.
Other people are like, so it's. I know what you're thinking. I was like, man, should I spend the extra $200 for the TTL version of that light? That was a hard decision for me because I was like, man, am I going to get my $400 worth out of that? I personally did in spades, but other people may not. So, yeah. When it comes down to speed lights, the difference is usually like $40-50, right?
Yeah. I mean,
That's almost a no-brainer.
Yes,
Even if you rarely use it, the times you do need it and you do use it, you'll get a shot that you're gonna really enjoy as
I will
opposed
give
to
you an
messing it.
example where it's extremely helpful though, and this is almost like a studio setup, but let's say you're hired to shoot people going to a high school dance. Or prom or something, yeah, whatever. Or any dance for that matter. And you've got a variety of people coming in and standing in front of your light to get the shots.
Yep.
And they're all different complexions, and they're all different outfits. And some have dark outfits, some have light outfits, some have white, some have whatever. That TTL capability can be handy from a time standpoint, because your flash can automatically, with the camera's meter, adjust accordingly off of that pre-burst for whatever their outfits is reflecting. So if their outfits is reflecting a lot of light, you don't want it all blown out, right? You want that to tone down some, and TTL can help do that. If it's a darker outfit and you want to bring out more detail in like a dark tux or something like that, it can help in that regard too. So it's not going to be a drastic swing in exposure, but it will help you get more perfect shots, I think, when your scenario changes so quickly.
Yeah.
Or if your ambient light changes so quickly.
Yeah.
And not just like
And in
your
those
time,
scenarios,
like,
you don't have a lot of space to work in. So even people that lean forward or lean back in the shot are going to change that light
Yes.
drastically. So, because they're going to step in or step out of the light. And because even if you put the X's on the floor, they're not there to get their picture taken. They want to get to the dance and spike the juice, right? So they just want to get this over with and move on.
Now, in that situation, what metering mode are you using with your camera?
Good question.
Well, I shoot Canon, so the most common used metering mode on Canon cameras is evaluative. And evaluative is
Matrix.
good even if it's a backlit subject. I mean, even it's designed in such a way with the algorithm in the camera to take into account backlighting as well. So even if people are standing in front of a backlit window or something, it can still do a pretty good job of that. So that's what I would typically use, unless I had a very specific concern about a specific part and getting detail in a specific part of their outfit or their face or whatever. Then I might go to something like partial or spot.
Yeah.
But normally I give a value to the go first and foremost.
Okay.
And another thing
You
about
find
TTL
yourself
is
using Matrix mostly?
For that kind of situation, yes.
If you're shooting like events mostly, or you're shooting like children playing, it might be worth, like, so if you're shooting things where you have to be fast and you want to use TTL, it'd be worth it. But if you're shooting things where you don't have to be fast, it may still be worth it to get it, because it's like, how much of your time do you want to spend? Because essentially, if we're doing this as a business, your time is your money. So is it worth it to spend the extra, like 400 you said you spent on it, to just get it and save time later when you may need it? Or do you want to just stick to it and don't use TTL ever? That's kind of how when I am purchasing new
Have
equipment.
to do a cost benefit.
I do. I
Yep.
check like what's my return on investment in this? Am I going to be spending, like, is this going to be my Bobcat of tools? Like, is this going to speed my job up a lot? Am I going to get more clients using this because I'm faster? Or like, do I want? And when I'm doing my fine art stuff,
And will you
I
have
try to
to
do
replace it
everything
with something
manual.
else later?
Exactly.
In which case, you just wasted whatever you spent now, because you want to
Exactly.
upgrade later.
yep.
Right.
So you have to. It's a lot of factors. So like style's a big one, but also like what are you using it for? So I like to have it just because I know I'm going to need it eventually. When I'm doing more fine art stuff where I'm not being paid to do it, I don't use it, but I still have it for when I do need
Yeah, in
it.
your back pocket kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're an Annie Leibovitz and you have like weeks or months to
Yeah.
design the one shot, and that's your one job because you're gonna get paid $1 million for it,
One day.
you
right?
got all the time in the world to
You
dial
don't-
that stuff in. If I'm trying to book this studio 4 sessions in a day,
Yep.
I don't have an hour I can put in between each of those to be able to go back in and reset the lights all back up. So